On the planet Zyphor, a world covered in vast jungles and towering mountains, strange creatures roamed beneath a golden sky. The planet's atmosphere shimmered with an unfamiliar glow, and the inhabitants, the Zyphorians, lived in peaceful harmony. Their advanced technology allowed them to travel the stars, and they had learned to live without war for centuries. They saw themselves as a superior species, believing in balance and understanding. But when a small human exploration ship crashed on their world, everything changed. Captain Marcus Hayward stood in front of the wreckage of the human spacecraft, his brow furrowed in concern. His crew had survived, but the ship was in bad shape. They were stranded. The planet's lush forests stretched endlessly before them, and they had no way of contacting their homeworld. The situation was dire. They were trapped, and they didn't know what kind of danger this new world might hold. "Everyone, stay sharp," Hayward ordered. His voice was calm but firm. "We need to repair the ship, but we have to be careful. We don't know what this planet's like yet." The crew, a mix of scientists and engineers, nodded and set to work. However, there was one thing Hayward didn't tell them. The stories they had heard about Zyphor's creatures, especially the Zyphorian scouts. According to legend, they were a highly intelligent species that had never been defeated in battle. They were said to be fierce and bloodthirsty, protecting their planet at all costs. A few hours passed, and the humans had made little progress. The ship was far from fixed, and the only thing they could do was wait and hope for a miracle. But that hope began to fade when Hayward noticed movement in the distance. From the edge of the forest, a figure appeared. At first, it looked like just another creature of the jungle, but as it came closer, it became clear it was no animal. Lyra, a young Zyphorian scout, emerged from the shadows. Her tall, slender figure moved gracefully, her piercing blue eyes scanning the humans with an air of superiority. She had heard the crash. The Zyphorians were a peaceful species, but they had learned over time that peace sometimes required action. When she saw the humans, she thought of the old stories. The stories that told of humans as dangerous, savage beings who would stop at nothing to conquer whatever they desired. Lyra's hand instinctively went to the weapon at her side, a long glowing blade designed for self-defense. She didn't know these humans, but she knew their kind had a history of causing chaos in the galaxy. Hayward, noticing the approaching figure, stood tall, ready to defend his crew if necessary. His training had prepared him for dangerous situations, but he had never faced a species like the Zyphorians. His mind raced as he quickly assessed the situation. "Stay back," he called out, his voice steady, though there was tension in his words. The last thing he wanted was a fight, but he wouldn't let his crew be attacked either. Lyra stopped, her eyes narrowing as she studied the human. She had heard the stories about their violence, their so-called bloodthirstiness, and she was determined to see for herself if the tales were true. She stepped forward cautiously, her expression unreadable. "I don't know what you are doing here, human," she said, her voice low but firm. "But you are trespassing on Zyphorian land. You will leave immediately, or we will deal with you." Hayward took a deep breath, keeping his hands visible and away from his weapon. "We're stranded," he said, his tone sincere. "We don't mean any harm. We need help." Lyra's gaze softened for a moment, but only for a second. She couldn't understand why the human would ask for help. After all, weren't they the ones who had invaded countless other worlds? She had been taught to be cautious with humans, to never trust them. "I will report this to the council," Lyra said, turning to leave. "Don't try anything. I'll be back soon." Just as she was about to disappear into the dense jungle, a loud rumble echoed through the sky. The ground beneath their feet shook violently, and Hayward could hear the distant crash of trees being uprooted. Something was coming. Lyra's eyes widened in alarm, and for the first time since she had encountered the humans, she seemed uncertain. "The storm," she muttered under her breath. "It's too close." Before Hayward could react, a massive tidal wave of water surged over the horizon, heading straight for the crash site. Lyra's eyes flicked back to the humans. In that moment, there was no time for distrust, no time for hesitation. She made a split-second decision. "Follow me," she ordered. Without waiting for a response, Lyra turned and ran toward the jungle, her long legs moving swiftly. Hayward, unsure of what to do, hesitated for only a second before motioning for his crew to follow. They had no choice but to trust her, even if only for a moment. The storm was too close, and they needed shelter. As they ran, the water began to rise behind them, the roar of the wave growing louder. Lyra led them deeper into the jungle, her sharp eyes darting around as if she knew exactly where to go. Hayward glanced at his crew, his thoughts racing. He had just encountered one of the very creatures his people had been warned about, and now she was leading them into the unknown. But as they moved further into the jungle, Hayward couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a strange and unexpected journey, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about both humans and Xiphorians. The dense jungle of Xiphor was unlike anything the humans had ever seen. The towering trees reached toward the sky, their leaves glowing faintly in the dim light. Strange plants with iridescent flowers lined the path, and the air was thick with the scent of unfamiliar fruits and herbs. It was a world both beautiful and mysterious, but it also felt incredibly alien. Lyra moved quickly, effortlessly weaving through the underbrush. The humans, however, struggled to keep up. They had only just arrived on this planet and were unaccustomed to the dense, humid jungle. Their clothes, made for space travel, were not designed for such a harsh environment. Captain Hayward glanced back at his crew, making sure everyone was keeping pace. They had no choice but to trust Lyra. The wave was closing in fast, and they couldn't afford to get separated. As they moved deeper into the jungle, Lyra slowed her pace and turned to face them. She studied the humans, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. They were, as she had expected, far less capable in this environment than she was. But there was something different about Hayward, something that caught her attention. "Why did you help me back there?" Lyra asked, her voice still cautious. "You had no reason to risk your life." Hayward frowned. "We don't leave people behind, no matter who they are." Lyra was silent for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she processed his words. It was so different from what she had been taught. Her people had always believed that humans were ruthless conquerors, driven by a need to dominate others. The stories she had heard as a child painted a picture of a species that would never hesitate to destroy anything in its path to gain power. And yet, here was Hayward, a human captain, risking his life to save her, someone he had never met before. "You're not like what I've heard," Lyra said, almost to herself. "You're not like them." Hayward looked at her, a bit surprised. "What do you mean?" Lyra's eyes flicked away, as if unsure whether she should continue. "The stories about humans, the ones that say you're all bloodthirsty, always fighting, always wanting more." Hayward's expression softened, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Those stories are old, and they don't paint the full picture. Yes, humanity's history has had some dark times, but it's also had moments of great kindness, of great sacrifice. We've learned a lot over the years. We've learned that there's more to life than fighting." Lyra was quiet, digesting his words. It was difficult for her to accept, but there was something about Hayward that made her think there might be truth in what he said. The path ahead grew steeper, and the group began to struggle more. The humans were sweating and tired, their movements slowing as they trudged through the thick jungle. Lyra, on the other hand, moved effortlessly, her long legs carrying her with ease over the uneven ground. "We need to find shelter," Hayward said, glancing up at the sky. The dark clouds from the wave had already begun to break apart, but a new storm seemed to be rolling in. The air was thick with humidity, and the atmosphere felt charged, like a storm was brewing. Lyra looked around, her eyes scanning the trees. "There's a cave not far from here. It's safe. Follow me." She led them through the jungle with a quiet confidence. The humans were starting to lag behind, their pace slowing with every step. Hayward stayed at the front, making sure his crew kept up, but his mind kept drifting back to Lyra. Her words had been unsettling, but they had also made him think. The Xiphorians were a proud species, but they had always kept to themselves. Hayward couldn't understand why she had even helped them, let alone why she was now speaking to him like this. There was clearly something more to her than just the stories he had heard. She wasn't just another alien, another species to be feared and distrusted, but there was still so much he didn't know about her, about Xiphor. And truth be told, he wasn't sure if he would ever truly understand. Finally, after what felt like hours of walking, they reached the cave. It was nestled in a small clearing, hidden behind thick vines and large stones. The entrance was wide enough for all of them to fit inside comfortably. Lyra entered first, moving with the grace of someone who had spent her whole life in this jungle. The humans followed closely behind, their faces showing signs of exhaustion. Hayward glanced back at his crew, making sure no one had been left behind. Everyone had made it safely inside. Once inside, the coolness of the cave offered them some relief from the oppressive heat of the jungle. Lyra set to work quickly, gathering some dry wood to start a fire. Hayward watched her silently, his thoughts still lingering on their earlier conversation. As Lyra worked, the humans gathered around, trying to get comfortable on the cold stone floor. The tension between them and their Xiphorian guide remained, though it was tempered by the storm outside. The storm had forced them into this situation, but Hayward couldn't shake the feeling that they were meant to be here, together. The fire flickered to life, casting a soft glow on the faces of the humans and the alien woman. The jungle outside seemed to grow quieter, as if the planet itself was watching them. Lyra finally spoke again, her voice soft. "I don't know why I helped you," she admitted, "but I couldn't leave you there to die. It's not what my people would do, but it feels right." Hayward smiled slightly, his voice calm. "Sometimes what's right isn't always what we've been taught." Lyra glanced at him, and for the first time, her expression seemed less guarded. She nodded slowly. For the first time since they had met, the two of them found a quiet understanding between them. There was still much to learn, and many obstacles ahead, but in that moment, they both knew they had taken the first step towards something new. Something unexpected. The storm outside the cave had intensified, with the sound of heavy rain pounding against the rocks. It was a relentless downpour, and the winds howled through the trees, bending them under the pressure. Inside the cave, the humans huddled around the small fire Lyra had managed to start. Its warmth was a comfort, though it wasn't enough to completely erase the discomfort of being stranded on an alien world. Hayward sat with his crew, their faces tired but determined. They had no choice but to wait until the storm passed before they could continue their work on repairing the ship. But there was more pressing concern on Hayward's mind. Despite the strange comfort he felt around Lyra, he still didn't fully understand her, or her people. Lyra sat by the fire, her legs crossed and her eyes watching the flames dance. She hadn't spoken much since they arrived in the cave. The tension between her and the humans was still there, though it had softened somewhat since their shared experience in the jungle. Hayward couldn't help but wonder if this was the calm before a storm of its own, whether the Xiphorian would continue to see him and his crew as enemies. After a few moments of silence, Lyra spoke up. Her voice was quieter now, almost hesitant. "I've been thinking," she began, glancing at Hayward, "about what you said earlier, about humanity." Hayward looked up, surprised. He hadn't expected her to open up like this, not after their difficult first meeting. "What about it?" he asked gently. Lyra hesitated, her fingers tracing patterns in the dirt. "The stories I grew up with, they painted humans as monsters. They said you were always looking for conflict, always fighting. But you..." She paused, looking at him for a long moment. "You're not like what I was taught." Hayward leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. "I understand. A lot of people think that about us. I won't deny that humans have made mistakes. We've fought wars, destroyed things we shouldn't have. But we've learned from those mistakes. We've changed. Lyra tilted her head, clearly intrigued. But how can I know that? How can I trust you when everything I've learned tells me not to? For a moment, Hayward remained silent. He knew how hard it could be to change someone's perception of an entire species. He had seen it in the eyes of his own people, too, how they viewed other species as enemies, as threats. But he also knew that the only way to prove themselves was through actions, not words. He looked around the cave, meeting the eyes of his crew. They had worked together, fought together, and survived together. In the end, that was all they had, each other. You're right. You can't just take my word for it. But if you stick around, you'll see. We might not be perfect, but we're trying to be better. We're trying to make a future where there's peace, not war. Lyra's gaze softened, though there was still a trace of doubt in her eyes. It's hard to believe when your people have done so much harm. I get that, Hayward said with a nod. But all we can do is show you who we are now, not who we were. The fire crackled between them, casting flickering shadows on the walls of the cave. Lyra leaned back against the cool stone, her mind racing. She had been taught to believe that humans were a dangerous species, but here she was, sitting with a human who was trying to prove otherwise. It didn't make sense. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that maybe, just maybe, Hayward was telling the truth. Before she could respond, one of Hayward's crew members, Lieutenant Collins, spoke up from the other side of the cave. His voice was strained, as if he was trying to remain calm. "Captain, we have a problem." Hayward immediately stood up, his instincts kicking in. "What's going on?" Collins glanced nervously at Lyra before continuing. "It's the ship. We've been working on it, but there's something strange happening. We don't know if it's the planet's energy field or something else, but we can't get it to stabilize. The engines might be beyond repair." The tension in the room grew and Hayward's heart sank. If the ship was beyond repair, they would be stranded here for much longer. He didn't know what kind of dangers this planet held, and he wasn't sure how long they could survive without their main source of transport. Lyra, who had been listening intently, stood up quickly. "Let me see the ship," she said suddenly, her voice firm and decisive. "I might be able to help." Hayward raised an eyebrow in surprise. "You can fix it." Lyra nodded, her eyes glinting with confidence. "I don't know your technology, but I studied ship systems before. I might not be able to repair it completely, but I can stabilize it for a little longer." Hayward exchanged a glance with his crew. It was a risk, but they didn't have many options. "All right," he said, "lead the way." The group made their way out of the cave and back toward the wreckage of the ship. The rain had eased, but the air was still thick with moisture. As they approached the ship, Lyra immediately went to work, examining the damaged systems. Hayward watched her, still skeptical but impressed by her focus and skill. She moved with precision, inspecting the damaged wiring and the shattered energy conduits. She worked quickly, muttering to herself as she made adjustments. Hayward was astonished at how much she seemed to know about the ship's systems, despite it being human technology. After what felt like hours, Lyra stood back, wiping her brow. "It's not perfect," she said, "but it should hold long enough for you to make repairs." Hayward felt a wave of gratitude. "Thank you." Lyra simply nodded, though her face remained unreadable. "Don't thank me yet. This planet is full of surprises. If we're going to survive here, we'll need to trust each other. Completely." As the group returned to the cave, Hayward couldn't help but think about her words. Trust. It was something they hadn't had before. But now, they were starting to build it, one small step at a time. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung heavy in the sky, casting a dim light over the jungle. The storm had left behind a wet, sticky atmosphere, and the air felt thick with moisture. The group was exhausted, but they had no choice but to continue. They couldn't afford to waste time. Their only hope of getting home was to repair the ship and Lyra had given them a small window of time to work. Hayward gathered his crew near the wreckage, the damaged ship standing like a giant, broken creature in the middle of the jungle. Despite Lyra's help, they knew the task ahead wouldn't be easy. The ship was a complex piece of technology, and it was far from its prime. Yet it was their only option. "We need to get this fixed, or we're stuck here," Hayward said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "Let's break into teams. We'll need to get the engine running first, then focus on communications. If we can't get a signal out, no one will know we're here." Lieutenant Collins nodded. "Got it, sir." As the crew got to work, Hayward walked over to Lyra, who had been standing a little apart from the others, watching the scene unfold with a quiet intensity. Her sharp eyes were constantly scanning the area, as if waiting for something to happen. "Thank you again," Hayward said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I know you didn't have to help us." Lyra glanced at him, her expression neutral, but there was something in her gaze that made Hayward think she was still weighing her thoughts carefully. "You're welcome," she said simply, though it was clear she wasn't one to show much emotion. "But it's not just because you helped me back in the jungle. I've been thinking about your people, about what you said. Maybe you're right. Maybe humans can change." Hayward wasn't sure how to respond to that. He had spent most of his life fighting to prove that humanity had learned from its mistakes, but it was hard to change the minds of those who had only known the stories of destruction. "I hope we can," he said, offering her a small smile. "We're still learning, but we're trying." Lyra nodded but didn't say anything more. Instead, she turned her attention back to the ship. She studied the damage for a moment before walking over to a section of the wreckage where Hayward's team was working. He followed her closely, watching as she knelt beside one of the damaged energy conduits. Her hands moved quickly, inspecting the wires and components with ease. "Let me try something," Lyra said, her voice calm but filled with authority. Without waiting for permission, she reached into the wreckage, her fingers working with swift precision. Hayward's crew exchanged looks but didn't stop her. They had seen what she was capable of the night before. If she could help, they would let her. Lyra's eyes narrowed as she found what she was looking for, an energy converter that had been completely fried. She gently pried it out of place, her movements almost delicate. "This part is beyond repair," she said, "but I can bypass it temporarily." Hayward was stunned. "You can fix that?" She glanced up at him. "I don't know if it'll hold for long, but I can try." With that, she began making the necessary adjustments, working quickly but carefully. Hayward couldn't help but watch, impressed by her skill. She wasn't just a warrior or scout. She was resourceful, clever. She wasn't like the Zephyrians he had been warned about, those who were supposed to be ruthless and cold. There was a depth to her that he hadn't expected. As she finished, she stood up and dusted off her hands. "It's not perfect, but it should get you enough power to get the engine going." Hayward nodded. "Thanks again, Lyra. You've saved us more than once now." Lyra simply nodded. But this time, Hayward noticed a faint smile tug at the corners of her mouth. It was subtle, but it was there. As the humans continued their work on the ship, Hayward found himself thinking about how much had changed since their crash. He had come to this planet expecting conflict, expecting to fight for survival. Instead, he had met someone who had challenged his assumptions about not only Zephyrians, but also about humanity itself. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing. Whatever it was, it wouldn't be the same as before. The day passed quickly as they worked together, humans and Zephyrian, each side contributing in their own way. By nightfall, they had made significant progress. The engines were running at half power, and the communication systems were just beginning to stabilize. There was still much to do, but they were closer to being ready for a rescue. As the fire crackled in the cave later that evening, the group gathered around, exhausted but hopeful. The tension had eased somewhat, but there was still the unspoken understanding that they were all on edge. They didn't know if their efforts would be enough to get them off the planet, and they didn't know if the Zyphorians would accept them once the ship was fully operational. Lyra sat at the edge of the group, quietly watching them. Her eyes flickered between the humans and the jungle beyond, always alert. Hayward noticed the way her posture was stiff, the way she was always prepared for anything, but there was something different in her demeanor now. She wasn't just a guard or a soldier anymore. She was something more. "We still don't know how long we have before the ship breaks down again," Hayward said, breaking the silence. "But whatever happens, we'll face it together." Lyra's gaze flickered toward him, her expression unreadable. "Yes," she said, her voice low but firm. "Together." For the first time, it felt like the humans and Zyphorians were on the same side, even if only for a moment. But that moment, small as it was a start. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something much bigger than either of them could have imagined. The days that followed were filled with tense anticipation. The ship's power systems were stable for now, but everyone knew they didn't have much time before it would fail again. Hayward and his crew worked around the clock, trying to repair what they could. Lyra, though not a member of their crew, had stayed with them, offering her assistance whenever she could. She was resourceful, always finding new ways to keep the ship running just a little longer. As the sun began to set each day, the group would gather around the fire in the cave, sharing a quiet meal and exchanging stories. The humans had learned more about the Zyphorians, and Lyra had begun to learn more about humanity, its resilience, its willingness to adapt, and, above all, its desire to survive. In some ways, she was beginning to understand the humans more than she ever thought possible. Still, there was an underlying tension. Trust had begun to form, but it was fragile. There were still so many unknowns. Would the Zyphorians allow them to leave when the ship was finally operational? Or would they view the humans as a threat, as they had before? One evening, as they sat around the fire, Hayward noticed Lyra was unusually quiet. She had been staring into the flames, her eyes distant, as if lost in thought. He could tell something was bothering her. "Lyra," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. "Is everything okay?" She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she shifted her gaze, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of uncertainty and something else, something Hayward couldn't quite place. Finally, she spoke. "I've been thinking," Lyra said, her voice calm but weighed down with emotion, "about what happens when we're ready to leave." Hayward leaned forward, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What do you mean?" Lyra hesitated, as if unsure how to continue. "The Zyphorians, they won't just let you leave, will they? Not without a price. They've never trusted humans before. We're seen as invaders, as a threat. How can I trust that my people won't come after you once you leave?" Hayward's heart sank. He had been worried about this moment, the moment when reality would set in, and their fragile peace would be tested. He could feel the weight of the question hanging in the air. He had no answers for her, at least not ones that would reassure her. "We don't want trouble with the Zyphorians," he said carefully, trying to choose his words wisely. "But we can't ignore the fact that we're stranded here. We need to get back to our people. We're not here to invade your world. We're just trying to survive." Lyra looked away, the conflict evident on her face. She was torn between loyalty to her people and the unexpected connection she had begun to feel toward the humans, toward Hayward in particular. "I understand," she said softly, "but I don't know if my people will see it that way. You're still strangers to them, and the stories, they're hard to forget." Hayward sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had hoped that by helping her, they could begin to bridge the gap between their species, but it seemed that fear and distrust were not so easily erased. "We don't have much time left," he said quietly. "I don't know what the future holds, but we'll figure it out together. We've come this far. I believe we can keep moving forward." Lyra didn't say anything for a long time. Instead, she stared into the fire, her face unreadable. The silence stretched on, thick with the weight of her unspoken thoughts. Finally, she stood up. "I need to go check on the ship," she said, her voice almost too calm. "I'll be back soon." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked toward the wreckage. Hayward watched her go, a knot tightening in his stomach. He knew the situation was becoming more complicated, and he feared they were running out of time. As night settled over the jungle, Hayward gathered his crew for their evening briefing. They had made significant progress, but everyone knew the ship wouldn't last much longer without more permanent repairs. Lyra had done all she could, but the damage was extensive. If they didn't find a way to stabilize the system soon, they would be trapped here indefinitely. "All right, everyone," Hayward said, addressing his team. "We're not out of the woods yet. We need to double down on the repairs and see if we can get the engines running at full power. We don't have time to waste." Collins nodded, his face grim. "Got it, Captain. We're on it." Hayward looked around at his crew, their faces tired but determined. They had been through a lot together, but he could tell they were all starting to lose hope. They had been stranded on this alien world for far too long, and every day felt like another battle they weren't sure they could win. As the crew dispersed to continue their work, Hayward lingered by the fire, lost in thought. He couldn't shake the feeling that Lyra's concerns were valid. What would happen when they were ready to leave? Would the Xiphorians allow them to go peacefully, or would they try to stop them? A soft sound broke through his thoughts, footsteps crunching in the wet underbrush. He turned to see Lyra returning from the wreckage. She had a pensive look on her face, and there was something in her eyes that told him she wasn't just worried about the ship anymore. "We need to talk," Lyra said, her voice serious. Hayward nodded, his heart skipping a beat. "What's on your mind?" Lyra took a deep breath, glancing over her shoulder toward the jungle, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "There's a way out of here, a way to make sure the Xiphorians don't interfere with your departure." Hayward's curiosity piqued. "What do you mean? How can we ensure that?" Lyra paused for a moment before answering. "I can help you, but it won't be easy. It'll require a lot of trust, from both sides." Hayward's mind raced. Trust. He had heard the word so many times before, but now it felt like the key to their survival. "Tell me what we need to do," he said quietly. Lyra nodded, her eyes focused and determined. "We'll need to work together more than ever before. This is a test of everything we've built so far." The night was quiet, save for the distant sounds of the jungle. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a soft, silver glow over the wreckage of the ship. The humans and Lyra sat in the small clearing near the fire, their faces illuminated by its flickering light. Hayward watched Lyra closely, sensing that she was about to share something important. "What kind of plan are you talking about?" Hayward asked, his voice low. He wasn't sure whether to feel nervous or hopeful. The weight of their situation hung heavily in the air, and it was clear that every decision they made from here on out would be critical. Lyra didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced around to make sure no one was listening. It was a habit she had developed, one she could never quite shake, even after spending so much time with the humans. Her people were cautious, always aware of potential threats, and she wasn't ready to let down her guard just yet. "This planet is not as peaceful as it seems," she began, her tone serious. "The Xiphorians have their own ways of dealing with outsiders. It's not just about war, it's about control. But if we're going to avoid a conflict, we need to act carefully." Hayward nodded, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean, control? And how does this tie into helping us get off this planet?" Lyra took a deep breath, as if weighing how much to reveal. "There's an ancient network, hidden deep within the planet. It's a kind of communication system. My people used it long ago to connect with one another across great distances. The Xiphorians have long forgotten it, but I know where it is." "Wait a second," Hayward interrupted, his eyes widening. "You're saying there's some kind of old technology that could help us?" Lyra nodded slowly. "Exactly. If we can access the network, I can send a signal strong enough to reach the nearest Xiphorian fleet. The message will be simple. We're not here to fight. We just need to leave. The idea was tempting. If they could send a message to the Xiphorian fleet, they might be able to avoid the conflict that seemed so inevitable. Hayward thought about it for a moment. It was risky, but it could be their best chance to get out of here without violence. If this works, we could have a chance to leave peacefully, Hayward said, almost to himself. But how do we even get to this network? And how do we know the Xiphorians will listen? Lyra's gaze was steady. That's where the trust comes in. I know where the network is located, but it's not easily accessible. We'll need to travel through the jungle, and we'll need to be careful. If we're seen by the wrong eyes, the whole plan could fall apart. The Xiphorians won't hesitate to destroy the signal. Hayward exchanged a look with Lieutenant Collins, who was standing a few feet away. The lieutenant nodded grimly, clearly understanding the risks involved. We'll need to be prepared for anything. If we're going to take this route, we need to move quickly and stay hidden. The crew's willingness to take a risk spoke volumes. Hayward had seen many of them struggle with fear, but here, in the face of the unknown, they were determined. He knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were united by a common goal: survival. "We can do it," Hayward said, looking back at Lyra. "But if we're going to move forward with this, we need to trust each other completely. No secrets." Lyra didn't hesitate this time. "I agree. We'll need to work as one. My people, they don't know you, but I'll do what I can to make them understand. You're not the enemies they think you are." A moment of silence passed between them. There was still so much that wasn't clear, so many dangers that lay ahead. But for the first time since the crash, Hayward felt a sense of hope. "We'll leave at dawn," Hayward decided. "Prepare everything you need tonight. Tomorrow, we move." The plan was set, but as the night wore on, Hayward couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Lyra had shared a lot, but there were still pieces of the puzzle missing. He trusted her, for now, but he wondered just how much she was keeping from him. The Xiphorians were a mystery, and even if she was on their side, there was no guarantee that the message they would send would be received the way they hoped. As the fire crackled and the group settled down for the night, Hayward lay awake, staring up at the stars. They were so far from home, so far from everything they knew. The silence of the jungle seemed to stretch on forever, a reminder that they were alone in an alien world. But in that silence, Hayward also realized something. This journey, this struggle, had brought them all together in ways he hadn't anticipated. The humans, the Xiphorians, they had been enemies, separated by fear and misunderstanding. But now, they were working side by side. And though the future was uncertain, Hayward felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: a sense of unity. When morning came, the group prepared to leave. They gathered their supplies and readied themselves for the journey through the dense jungle. The ship was left behind, its power systems stabilized but not fully functional. They had no choice but to move forward. As Hayward gave the signal to begin, Lyra stepped forward, her face calm but focused. "Stay close," she said, her voice firm. "We don't know what's ahead, but if we stay together, we'll make it." Hayward nodded. "Together," he echoed. And with that, they set off into the jungle, knowing that this journey would test their resolve, their trust, and their survival. The path ahead was unknown, but one thing was certain: they were no longer just humans and Xiphorians. They were something more, bound together by a fragile but growing bond. The jungle was dense, and the air thick with humidity as Hayward and his team followed Lyra through the undergrowth. The path was narrow and difficult to navigate, but Lyra moved with ease, her eyes constantly scanning for any signs of danger. Hayward couldn't help but admire her skill. She was in her element, confident and steady, even as the shadows of the trees seemed to close in around them. Behind him, Lieutenant Collins kept a close watch on the rear, while the rest of the crew followed as quietly as possible. The jungle was full of life, and every sound seemed amplified in the stillness of the early morning. Hayward could hear the rustling of leaves, the calls of unseen creatures, and the occasional drip of water from the trees. It was a world unlike any he had ever known, and for a moment it almost felt peaceful. But Hayward knew better. There was no peace on this planet. Not yet. They were still far from the network that Lyra had mentioned, and they had no idea what obstacles lay in their path. "Keep moving." Lyra's voice broke through his thoughts, sharp and commanding. "We're getting closer, but it's not safe to linger." The group quickened their pace, moving in unison. Hayward could sense the tension among his crew. They were all exhausted from days of non-stop work, and their nerves were beginning to fray. Still, they pushed on, driven by the hope that Lyra's plan would work. If they could reach the network and send the message, they might finally get the help they needed. After what felt like hours of trekking through the dense jungle, the path began to widen. The trees thinned out, and ahead of them, Hayward saw a small clearing. At the center of the clearing stood a structure, ancient and overgrown with vines, but still standing tall. It was made of smooth stone, worn by time but still intact. "This is it," Lyra said quietly, stepping forward. "The entrance to the network." The group gathered around, examining the structure. It wasn't much to look at, just a large stone archway, half hidden by the thick growth around it. But Hayward could sense the importance of the place. It was old, but it had been built with purpose, and its silence spoke volumes. Lyra walked up to the archway and placed her hand on the stone. Her fingers traced a pattern along the surface, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low hum, the stones around the archway began to shift, revealing a narrow passage leading into the darkness beyond. Hayward felt a wave of unease wash over him. It wasn't just the unknown that bothered him. It was the feeling that they were stepping into something far older, far more complex than they could understand. "Is it safe?" Hayward asked, his voice low. Lyra nodded. "Yes, it's safe, but you need to understand, once we enter, we won't be able to turn back. The Xiphorians might sense the signal if we're not careful." Hayward hesitated. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. If they succeeded, they could leave this planet and return to their people. But if something went wrong, it could all come crashing down. "We're ready," Hayward said finally, his voice steady. "Let's do this." With that, the group entered the passage, moving single file into the dark. The walls were cool to the touch, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and moss. Lyra led the way, her movements swift and sure. Hayward followed closely, his eyes adjusting to the dim light that filtered in through cracks in the stone. The passage twisted and turned, narrowing in some places and widening in others. The deeper they went, the more Hayward felt the weight of history pressing in on him. This was no ordinary place. It was something ancient, a remnant of a time long past. After what felt like an eternity, the group finally reached the end of the tunnel. Before them stood a large chamber, its walls lined with strange symbols and glowing crystals embedded in the stone. At the center of the room was a raised platform, and on it, a device unlike anything Hayward had ever seen. It looked like a mix between an ancient artifact and a piece of advanced technology, its surface covered in intricate patterns. "This is the core of the network," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was built to transmit signals across vast distances, connecting my people. I can activate it, but once I do, we'll have very little time." Hayward nodded, his heart racing. "Do whatever you have to do." Lyra stepped forward and placed her hands on the device. As she did, the glowing crystals around the room flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The air hummed with energy, and Hayward could feel the charge building in the room. The device slowly powered up, its strange patterns glowing brighter with every passing second. "We have to hurry," Lyra said, her voice urgent. "Once the signal is sent, we'll be exposed. We'll need to leave immediately." Hayward felt the tension rise as the device whirred to life. The signal was being sent now, and there was no turning back. They had to hope the Xiphorians would receive it, that they would listen and allow them to leave. As the last pulse of energy left the device, Lyra stepped back, wiping the sweat from her brow. It's done. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled. A low rumble echoed through the chamber, and Hayward could feel the change in the air. They were not alone. "We need to go. Now," Lyra shouted. The group turned and sprinted back toward the passage, their hearts pounding. The tremors were growing stronger, and Hayward knew that whatever had been awakened in this place was now in motion. They had done it. They had sent the signal. But now, the true test began.